All right. Greetings, everybody. My name is Subijanto, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee of New York Southeast Asia Network. I'm also an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Baruch College-CUNY University of New York. It is such an honor for me to welcome all of you here in this room and also those on Zoom to the launch of Enduring Otherwise, Muslim, Queer, and Trans Worldmaking in Indonesia by our brilliant colleague here, Ferdiansyah Thajib. So I'm going to introduce Thajib shortly, and then we're going to have Thajib present his book, and then after that, it will be followed by a Q&A. Ferdi. All right, so Ferdiansyah Thajib, or Ferdi, is a researcher and educator whose life work unfolds at the intersections of theory and lived experience, grounded in queer world-making practices and the effective entanglements of the everyday. He is currently a senior lecturer in the Elite Master Program Standards of Decision-Making Across Cultures at the Friedrich-Alexander Universität, Erlangen-Nürnber, Germany, where he teaches psychological anthropology and gender and sexuality studies with a regional focus on Indonesia and a broader Southeast Asia. In 2020, he earned a doctorate from Freie Universität Berlin, and afterward, he joined Leipzig University for a year as a postdoctoral fellow with the Children and Nature Working Group. Ferdi is also an artist, curator, and community educator, focusing on the transformative potential of self-organization through studying together. These interests are closely tied to his involvement with CUNY. It's a very famous community in Indonesia, CUNY Study Forum and Collective. It's an undisciplinary. It's funny. I asked him actually, is it really undisciplinary? But it is true. He called it undisciplinary research initiative in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, because it's a interdisciplinary is out of focus, out of trend. But everyone, please welcome Ferdi.
So yes, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming in this nice and sunny afternoon, but also but also cold. And I want to thank especially Anne for organizing everything. Basically, since we started, we met actually in Thailand last year, and I was mentioning about the book and come to New York, and so I kind of like follow up on that. And then of course there's Emily as well, John, and Margaret from the NYSEAN network team. Meredith Weiss is not here, but also the Southeast Asia Consortium, and those who come today to join us here online as well. So because this book is just come out like what now is on the 18th, like 8 days ago. On the 10th, it was officially out. So this would be actually the first time ever I will talk about it in public. And it might be also I use it an opportunity as for a bit of a rehearsal because like so please bear with me. I will share some snippets from the book as well so that maybe you'll be interested to get it and read some more. For the next 40 minutes, I prepare a kind of presentation, but actually I didn't provide much in the visual, hoping that you might want to maximize your capacity to listen. Also because of my strong Indonesian English accent. And one last thing before I start, some of what I will share here might be triggering, so your discretion is advised. Okay, can I borrow the book? I forgot to bring mine. let me start with the opening, the first 3 pages of the book, basically, the introduction. I hope those who are online also can hear well. So yeah, in early 2018, many months after I had completed my fieldwork in Indonesia, as I was at my laptop struggling to write up my PhD thesis at home in Berlin, an alarming update popped up in my social media newsfeed. It was a report about a police raid on hair salons run by Transpuan in a district in Indonesia's northwesternmost province of Aceh. Transpuan is a shorthand term for transgender perempuan or transgender woman. And during the raid, 12 transpuans from 5 different hair salons were rounded up. The police beat them, shaved their heads, and stripped them of their clothes in public. They then ordered them to wear men's clothes. The 12 transpuans were placed in police custody, although they were released the next morning following pressure from legal aid and human rights activists in the province. In Aceh, hostility towards sexual and gender minority was common during my research from 2013 to early 2015. While I was there, local legislators drafted Kanun Jinayat, a local criminal bylaw that was issued as part of the implementation of Sharia law that began in 2001, when the national government gave permission for local Acehese authorities to operate their own legal system. The situation for sexual and gender minorities in the region continued to worsen following the passage of this new criminal law in October 2015, so just after my fieldwork finished, basically. The law subjected those allegedly involved in consensual same-sex practices to maximum punishment of flogging 100 times in public, a fine of 1,000 grams of gold, or 100 months in prison. Less than a year later, the wave of hostility toward people with non-heteronormative sexualities and transgender expressions swept through many other parts of the country. They were violently targeted by mob violence at the behest of their neighbors and local vigilantes. Police raided their private gatherings and their premises. People were beaten up, arrested, and imprisoned based on allegations of same-sex activity. Increasingly, non-heterosexual and gender non-conforming expressions have become taboo, and those who practice them are persecuted in public spaces, such as city streets, universities, and cultural centers, as well as on the internet and through other media. So coming back to the story about the women who were arrested, the first reaction upon finding about the police raid in 2018 was panic. The incident took place only a few kilometers away from one of my field sites, a peri-urban node that I called Namu. This is a pseudonym. For 10 months, my research activities had centered on a hair salon that I called Salon Primadonna. The owner of the salon, a 27-year-old transpuan named Maya, also a pseudonym, was kind enough not to only allow me to participate in everyday life in her salon, but also to use it as a space for interviewing some of her employees and friends. She also offered the salon as a place for me to live for the duration of my research. This allowed our relationship to grow beyond the conventional research participant relation. And when I saw the news of the police raid, I immediately grabbed my phone to contact Maya via WhatsApp. Maya responded right away and reported that at that very moment, a number of friends and herself were all inside a rented minivan heading out of Aceh. The group included her 5 employees and 6 close friends who either own or work in hair salons in Namu. Over the following weeks, we maintained contact with each other, mainly to organize logistical support in a temporary shelter, which location of which remain undisclosed even to me. During this period, on a couple of occasions, I asked Maya whether she and her friends were considering the possibilities of settling somewhere outside Aceh. Her answers to my questions were similar each time. They had considered this option, but would rather wait and see how the situation evolved. About 8 weeks later, Maya and her friends decided to return home. When they returned, they learned that gender nonconformity, or defined in an official letter issued by the local government as, I quote, imitating the opposite sex in hair salons, had been officially banned in a number of regencies across Aceh, including Namu. The impact of this draconian policy caused a major breakdown of the dynamics at Salon Prima Donna. Maya told me that since the ban, she and her friends have avoided having group meeting or spending time in the hair salon beyond normal working hours. The Sharia police, or the so-called Wilayatul Hisbah, were regularly inspecting her hair salon to check if she or any of her employees were breaking the municipal government's prohibition on wearing women's clothing. Life inside the hair salon, as they knew it, had drastically changed. The story of Maya and her friends' return to Namu and their insistence on staying there, even though they knew that they could no longer live in the same way as before, is a prime example of a broader pattern within Muslim queer and transgender life in Indonesia, where everyday hardships are marked by periods of violence and social exclusion. Because public spheres in Indonesia increasingly display antagonistic responses towards sexual and gender minorities, this book is concerned with understanding those affected by this. How this book is concerned with understanding those affected by this chronic violence field. What compels individuals to continuously inhabit spaces of ambivalence despite their physical fatigue, mental exhaustion, and emotional pain? What happens when one's idea of a good life has consequences that are inherently harmful? Why do people whom society considers to be morally abject persist in using the language of morality that has been weaponized against them? Why do outright rejection and discrimination not deter marginalized individuals from occupying public spaces? Why do these actors persist in seeking ways to be together, even if being together does not necessarily make them less vulnerable to violence? These questions, which emerge from a long-term ethnographic engagement in Indonesia, guide the book attempts to bear witness to the affective experiences of those who continuously dwell in the impasses and promises of queer and trans religiosity within a predominantly Muslim society, an intersection mainly perceived across world religions as a site of profound dissonance. Much has been written about this tension, including in various online and offline think pieces, personal writings, and documentary films, as well as publications by a diverse number of collective initiatives. In Indonesia, as is in the case in other regional contexts where there is a growing influence of conservative Islam across a range of public spheres, this tension is based on popular interpretation of Quranic passages and hadith, or the sayings and practices of Prophet Muhammad, that purportedly forbid homosexuality and gender nonconformity. Indeed, the experiences of Muslim non-heterosexual and transgender people have been taken up as subject matters by scholars from a range of academic disciplines, all with differing theoretical assumptions, methodological techniques, and cultural contexts. My ethnographic research, however, has been deeply informed by my observation as a Muslim queer who have lived large parts of my life in Indonesia. So in English, the English word endurance carries a cluster of meanings. It is about continuing despite obstacles, putting up with what is painful, remaining firm under pressure, lasting through difficulty. Often, it simply means not giving up, sometimes because there are no other options. Historically, the concept first emerged in the context of modern endurance sports in the early 20th century, where scientists studied how the human body sustained efforts over time. But more recently, especially in the work of anthropologist Elizabeth Pofinelli, endurance has taken on a different significance. It has become a way of understanding how marginalized communities continue to live under conditions of chronic hardship, structural violence, and ongoing inequality. For Povinelli, endurance, and I quote, the ability to suffer and yet persist. It describes a space where human agency exists, but also meets its limits. What I want to suggest is that endurance is not just a condition. It is an experience that unfolds across time, through the body, and within forms of action. First, there's the time dimension or the temporal dimension, where endurance often feels like being stuck in time. When hardship stretches indefinitely, it can feel as though time itself slows down or even stops. Struggles against marginalizations are not momentary. They can extend across generations, carrying both historical burdens and future hopes. Life in such condition can feel suspended, slow, stagnant, and without clear resolution. Second, endurance is deeply embodied. It leaves mark on the body and on relationship. It involves exhaustion, debilitation, and emotional strain. As Povinelli reminds us, this condition can affect not only physical health, but also social bonds, straining friendship, families, and one's sense of self. Third, endurance sits within a spectrum of human action alongside the more two other familiar concepts, which is survival and resilience. Survival is about doing what must be done to stay alive, and it is often dismissed as passive, reduced to mere existence. But survival actually is never passive. It requires effort even when the effort remains invisible. It is written into the small details of everyday life. While, in contrast, resilience is about adaptation, bouncing back, recovering, moving forward. It has become a celebrated ideal, especially within neoliberal frameworks, where the good subject is expected to adapt and remain productive despite forms of violence, despite adversity. Critics of the concept of resilience point out that it can perform a subtle violence where framing marginalized communities as religion or as resilient often becomes a comforting narrative for those in positions of privilege. It suggests that the poor are inherently strong, that they can withstand ongoing hardship, and that they will adapt and recover no matter how much they are being stepped on. In this sense, resilience risks normalizing suffering while deflecting attention from the structural conditions that produce it. However, I argue that attending to endurance reveals what romanticized narrative of resilience often obscure. Not just the capacities of individuals and communities to persist, but also the toll exacted by ongoing structural violence. So endurance kind of like sits in between this concept about survival, which is about what has to be done, and resilience is about what can be done, and endurance is about dealing with the questions of what ought to be done in order to continue living. Reflecting on the chronic condition of humanitarian aid workers confronted in Palestinian refugee camps, Ilana Feldman addresses the ethical and political quandaries of endurance in social projects that aim to, and I quote her, help people live better with circumstances they cannot change. Feldman underscores the value of endurance as an imperative if in situations of prolonged conflict where humanitarian assistance faces a reality where, again, I quote her, nothing you can do seems likely to have much effect. She also highlights how endurance ultimately remains fraught with a profound ethical political conundrum, both for the humanitarian actors and their recipients. And to quote her again, is continuing to live enough of a goal when there is so little opportunity to thrive? And can life really be valued when they are not valued equally? While Feldman's line of questioning is informed by the occupational demands of preserving life of others, the ethical political conundrums faced by the communities involved in my research are deeply shaped by the everyday urgencies of self-preservation. Alternatively, then, the prime concern of this book is about the question of how, through gesture of endurance, people make effort to help themselves and each other to live better with circumstances they cannot change. So the more pertinent question framing this inquiry are, what do the protagonists of this book consider enough of a goal as they continue to live a life with less opportunity to thrive? And what counts as valued life for those whose life are continuously devalued as unequal? So the question shifts. What counts as enough when thriving is out of reach? This book argues that endurance, rather than limiting agency, can also be or can actually be a side of world making, such as suggested by the title. Although some scholars have suggested that endurance is non-political, that is simply about getting by without imagining a different future. But I want to challenge that view by drawing on the work of queer feminist scholarship, particularly the work of Sabah Mahmood and Sarah Ahmed, where it taught me to approach agency differently, basically, where it is not only about resisting norms, it is also about how people inhabit them, sometimes ambivalently, sometimes in ways that subtly transform them. Sarah Ahmed, for instance, described how queer life do not simply reject or conform to norms. Instead, they rework them from within. This process is often uncomfortable, and that discomfort at the same time can be generative. It opens up possibilities for living differently, not outside norms, but alongside and through them. And this is what I call the otherwise. Enduring otherwise does not mean breaking free from all constraints. It does not represent a radical rupture. Instead, it emerges within the ordinary routines of life in small gestures, subtle adjustments, everyday negotiation. It's about making and remaking possibilities within conditions that remain deeply constrained. In the context of Muslim and queer trans world making, endurance is also deeply intertwined with faith, or what many of the interlocutors describe as keyakinan in Indonesia. Faith is not simply as an institutional religion, nor purely personal spirituality. It is an affective and ethical orientation that connects people to meaning, to others, and to a sense of what a good life might be. But faith is also experienced as a double bind. On one side, it can impose constraint, especially within conservative interpretation that prohibits same-sex intimacy and gender nonconformity. On the other side, it provides resources for endurance, for making a sense of suffering, for sustaining hope, and for imagining alternative ways of being. Endurance then is far from heroic. It is often exhausting. It involves withstanding, living through, and sometimes simply putting up with painful reality. It unfolds within shrinking social spaces and limited material conditions. And yet, by continuing to continue, people also keep open the possibility that things might be otherwise. Religion, in this context, Islam, also becomes both a source of constraint and resource for transformation. And this is what the book seeks to show, that endurance is not merely about persistence, it's about ongoing work of creating livable worlds within unlivable conditions. And perhaps most importantly, it invites us to rethink agency itself, not as resistance alone, but as the capacity to endure, to inhabit, and to imagine otherwise. Are you good with time? Next one is the context of my research. So, more than 2 decades ago, Lauren Berlan and Michael Warner described queer worldmaking as a social project, one that opens up spaces of possibility. In a similar vein, Jose Esteban Munoz described queer worldmaking as not only a way of being in the world, but also a way of inventing it. This book builds on these insights, but shifts the focus. It asks, what does worldmaking look like for Muslim and queer trans community in Indonesia? One of the key moves I made is to place Muslim before queer and trans. This is not just a semantic choice. It reflects how many of my interlocutors understand themselves. I was asked by one of them, for instance, at the very beginning, when I told them about my research question or topic, and his answer was, what if someone identifies first as Muslim and then only then becomes a queer, or after that becomes queer? This question stayed with me because commonly, especially among Anglophone scholarship, it is common to treat religion as just one aspect of identity. But in the Indonesian context, Islam is central. It shapes ethical life, social relations, and everyday practices. So rather than treating Islam as something that intersects with queerness, I approach this as a structuring force within which queer and trans live our life. Oh, sorry, queer trans lives are lived. At the same time, Muslim is also not a fixed or unified category. In Indonesia, where the vast majority of people identify as Muslim, it encompasses a wide range of belief, practices, and political orientations. And since the political reforms of 1998, I will talk about this further later, these dynamics have become even more complex with the rise of competing Islamic movement, growing public expression of piety, and has written about that, and increasing tension around morality and belonging. Within this landscape, the term queer and trans also take on particular meanings. Queer, the borrowed English term, began circulating in Indonesia in the early 2000s, especially in urban and activist circles. I was one of them. Its adoption has been uneven, but it has offered a way for people to form connections, not necessarily based on identities or identical identities, but also on a shared sense of similarity, or being what Evelyn Blackwood calls samajiwa, or having the same soul. It also functions as a more indirect term, a euphemism almost, one that can sometimes soften the stigma attached to the more fixed labels such as gay or lesbian. While the term trans, on the other hand, locally for a longer time, trans women in Indonesian is called waria, but the term trans itself gained visibility more recently, particularly since the mid 2000s. and again used by activists at the beginning to articulate new forms of recognition and to connect local identity to global conversations. At the same time, its adoption has sparked debates across generations about how best to name and represent life experience. This is the debate between Waria and Transpuan, basically. So rather than treating these terms as stable categories, I approach them as a part of an ongoing process, one that reflects both local histories and transnational influences. And this brings us to another question. What kind of world is being made and unmade at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and religion in Indonesia? To understand this, we need to look at the longer and more complex history of attitudes towards gender and sexuality, and gender and sexual diversity in Indonesia, because like at different moments, these have been met with a mix of tolerance, but also disapproval. But in recent decades, there has been a noticeable shift toward heightened rejection and repression. Under the Suharto's New Order regime, the state began to regulate gender and sexuality more tightly. And this was reinforced by the cultural and political ideology of family principles, which is asas kekeluargaan, which focus more on the formation of cis heterosexist nuclear family, paternal family. And since around 2006, after the political transition in 1998, after Suharto stepped down, basically one might have expected greater openness. Yet in many ways, everyday heterosexism continued to persist and even intensified. Since around 2016, not long after the legalization of gay marriage in the US, anti-LGBT discourse has become increasingly prominent, often framed through narratives of moral panic. They are not, or sexual and gender minorities are not portrayed only as different, but also as threats and dangerous precisely because they are seen as invisible, blending into everyday life. This rhetoric echoes older political anxieties, where unseen enemies were imagined as undermining the nation from within. And this is talking specifically about the communist history of Indonesia, where people who are alleged or family members of those related of communists are framed as like lurking, as ghosts moving around in the community and recruiting. Yeah, and this continues until now, and can speak more about that. So today, similar fears are projected onto queer and trans communities. This is a world where Muslim and queer and trans desires for acceptance are persistently met with mainstream responses that perceive them as threats. Despite the deep fractures in Muslim queer trans people relationship with it, this remains the only world they have. Muslim queer and trans worldmaking, in this sense, does not aim at a complete escape or a radically separate world. Instead, it unfolds within the brokenness of the existing one. It involves working with what is available, relationship practices practices and fragments of meaning to small but significant openings. And these openings is what I again call the otherwise or the otherwise possibilities. My reference here is the work of Ashon Crowley, who worked on Black Pentecostal Breath. I suggest you read it. It's a really good book. So, by otherwise possibilities, these are not fixed destinations. They are not fully formed alternatives waiting to be realized. Rather, they are these often fleeting, fragile spaces that emerge in everyday acts, in how people relate to one another, how they interpret their faith, how they navigate constraints, and how they imagine and practice different ways of living. Am I good with time? Ooh. Okay. So maybe I just go through quickly with my approach in terms of my field work. Is grounded in the so-called what I call affective ethnography, a way of doing research that takes emotions and feelings seriously as a central to how knowledge is produced. So what happened when we do research about emotional topics and difficult topics is that sometimes we frame it as like something that is detached from us, right? This is what the protagonists feel or how they experience it. But my approach is always to also put myself in the relationship, including how they affected me, but also how I affected them in the interaction. And this I call the tool that I use is called following the heart or mengikuti kata hati. Actually, also kind of like based on this dichotomy between the difference between the heart where the emotion lies and the head is where the rational thinking works. But the aim here is not to reproduce this binary, but actually to engage with following the heart as a mode of homing in on the researcher's capacity to affect and be affected in relation to all elements of fieldwork encounter, including environments, places, situation, materialities, and people in the process of writing an ethnographic account. Many of the steps that I took, if you read the book, mainly depended on what to me felt right. This is shaping the decision of who I work with in the field, who I distance myself from, which methods I use to elicit stories. But at the same time, this feeling right was never entirely based on my own experience, but was generated through moments of sharing feelings together with others in the field. So I used I didn't necessarily use interview, but there's this kind of colloquial way of talking among friends called curhat in Indonesian, which is an acronym for curahan hati or pouring one's heart out. And so I continue try to hold space for these curhat moments, and at some points, even some of the protagonists kind of felt addicted to it and then wanted to ask to see me and then just talk because it's not a therapy because I didn't do much actually, but actually it's like therapy.
Yeah.
Right? Because I didn't say much as well. So yeah, maybe because of time I won't be able to focus on more on the methods, but we can maybe discuss it during the discussion. Just a brief description on what waits for you in the book. You can think of the chapters as the multiple hearts of the project. Each one approaches Muslim queer and trans world making from a different angle, focusing on the affective dynamics that shape the life of the people I met. But rather than following a strictly linear progression, the chapter moved between or back and forth between personal narrative and collective interaction. This moment reflects how affect itself circulates across bodies, relationship, and situation. Chapter 1 illuminates how Muslim queer and trans world making is permeated by what is called conflict batin or inner conflict. Psychologically nuanced catchphrase, inner conflict captures perfectly the lived experience of many of the people I met who experienced significant emotional and mental turbulence resulting from their failure to reconcile with existing norms. The chapter draws on life stories of three protagonists, two Muslim men who are attracted to other men, but that does not identify as neither queer nor gay. maybe MSM, but I'm also not sure because they don't define it as such. Rizky in Jakarta, and then Tino in Aceh. And then there's also Anna, self-identified ex-Muslim queer in Yogyakarta. Oops. Sorry.
That's your own mark.
Yes. And then on the second chapter, I bring this idea of inner conflict. This is something that people felt inside, but then what happened when it emerged in interactions. And this focus on more through two group interaction in Aceh with the transpuan community in Namu and a gay community in Ranchong. It examines how the affective dynamics of moral and ethical engagement in Aceh in Muslim queer and trans worldmaking have emanated through interpersonal relationship. Chapter 3 takes a detour into the life story of two protagonists, Maya, whom I already introduced earlier, and Ali, who identify as Muslim gay. And this focus more on how their life were shaped by trauma and injury since they were very young until now, basically. And the fourth chapter expands the discussion also to a collective level, drawing on two case studies, again with the trans community in Aceh, but also a queer of faith activist camp, queer of faith activist camp in Yogyakarta. Maybe as a closing, when I embarked on my research more than a decade ago, I was primarily concerned with the apparent ruptures between religion, non-heterosexuality, and gender non-conformity. In popular discourse, living religiously has often been considered as incompatible or irreconcilable with living as queer or trans. My curiosity centered on how individuals navigate the tensions arising from conflicting identities and practices, and practically how they attempt to reconcile them. However, through the narrative of the protagonist in this book, I have come to understand that the coexistence of conflicting desires, practices, and discourses is not a problem to be solved. Instead of perceiving these contradictions as hurdles to overcome, I have learned that they are fundamental to how these people live, endure, and make meaning in their life. And these contradictions are inherently human, so that it led me to shift the focus of my study toward understanding how then they stay with these contradictions without an end. Muslim queerness and transness in this sense are not simply conditions of marginalizations. They are ways of inhabiting complexity, ways of living within tensions that do not disappear. In some way, this resonates with philosophical ideas about affirmative ethics, the notion that ethical life involves transforming difficult experiences into something livable, such as the work of Rossi by Doty, for instance. There is a sense in which those who have experienced pain develop particular capacities to rework it, to make it bearable, even meaningful. And indeed, many of the people in this book do precisely that. But it is important to be careful here. Endurance is not always about transformation in a positive sense. Often it looks like slow exhaustion, ongoing frustration, or a sense of being stuck. At the center of this life is faith, which is an enduring force, not only about wanting to achieve a good life, but also a good afterlife. This is where this is also a tweak or a twist of Lauren Berlant concept of cruel optimism in more like post-secular context. The possibilities for attachment of a good life also appear to echo Baridoti's call to transcend pain, through affirmative ethics. However, in its emphasis in transforming negative experience into something productive, the positive push in this kind of affirmative ethics runs the risk of underestimating both the difficulty and the potential of staying with pain. As Sarah Ahmed points out, the pressure to get over pain can generate new forms of suffering for those who are not yet ready or able to move on. The protagonists in this book have spent their life grappling with harm, and most of them show little sign of moving forward, and perhaps they never will. But as I listened to their stories and engaged with their daily life during my fieldwork, it became clear that our interaction had formed in itself an ethics of witnessing, one that called for staying with ruptures rather than rushing to transcend them. This is not about glorifying pain, but about recognizing the importance of sitting with difficult emotions, bearing witness to them, and understanding that not everything broken can or should be repaired immediately. For many of the protagonists, the intention is not to transform suffering into something positive, but rather to preserve their life and sustain relational connection amid ongoing violence. And through these processes, they learn to understand how difficult affects have helped shape who they are. Ethical growth, in this sense, is not about getting rid of unwanted feelings in exchange for more desirable ones. Rather, it involves cultivating a deep understanding and building a complex relationship with both, even when they don't like. In this process, the ruptures themselves become effective sites for engaging with the world differently. And through the lens of Muslim queer and trans worldmaking, then endurance takes form as an affirmative way of becoming otherwise. By attending to the limits and possibility of staying with pain, and individuals and communities not only strive to overcome its damaging effects, but they also cultivate the capacity to endure what might come next. This mode of living is a social project towards otherwise possibilities that is humbled by the constraints and resources of the world we inhabit. And by faithfully staying with this world, the protagonist ultimately transforms the boundaries that it permits. So just, it's not really a wrap up because as I said, there's no end. Recently I listened to an interview podcast with Ocean Huang, and you can find it available online. Something clear in me when we got to the part when he spoke about his go-to practice, which is Buddhist prayer. And toward the end of this podcast, he said, for him, this prayer is about putting the suffering into the room, like through meditation or chanting. And he said, I quote him, it starts with thinking about own suffering, and then you start thinking about someone's close to you, your brother or your sister. Think about them with their heads down, and then all of a sudden a powerful thing happens. I think this is another glimmer. When you hold your suffering, you suffer more. And when you hold someone else's suffering, you start to feel compassion, you start to feel love. And I think this is some more resonance of what I mean by enduring it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I'm gonna give a very brief remark so that we're gonna have introduction. A discussion. But I'm gonna start by saying that there's so many good books out there, but not all of them touch your soul. This one touched my soul, and it will last for a long time. Thank you for touching my soul. But really, you take us through the story of Muslim queer and trans life with such powerful narratives, very careful also, and zooming closely into the mundane detail of the everyday life of these people. As we're looking at that mundane, we as the readers, we learn and also almost viscerally experience, feels like we experience it, that dangers that they're lurking behind, for being Muslim queers and trans. And for being Muslim, queers, and trans in Indonesia, it means also exposing themselves to continuous everyday danger, right? And actually also attempt at annihilation. You know, when you tell a story, the story of this, Ali, for example, whose family really wanted him to convert to become hetero. But there is another book actually that also touches my soul. It's Buried Histories by John Brusa. It is about the communist massacre in 1965. I was struggling. I was reading this book over the weekend. I was struggling why this book keep make me refer back to Buried Histories. And I think it's because both of the communists, there are differences between what the communists in Indonesia when they were massacred, right, experience, and the queer and trans people experience in Indonesia. Of course, they're different in terms of resistance, because you're talking about everyday resistance, about resisting by living within, while the communists are outside of that system. In terms of nature, also they're different, because the communists are different in terms of their political orientation in minority that the state continuously until today, when they don't exist anymore, continue to want to destroy. While in this case, it's gender and sexuality. But I realized that both stories tell us something about the state, about Indonesia as a state, Indonesia as bangsa, as a nation, how we define ourselves, our shared national identity, our shared experiences and our togetherness, and the space that we create together, those exclusion that we create in terms of political orientation and gender, etc. Also about power, how power is being used, to again exclude, reduce people into bare life, to borrow Agamben, right? Bare life means once you are bare life, you're basically, your blood is halal to be killed, things like that. You are outside of us. But also about religion, because the communists, even until today, I mean, in its time especially, they try to reinterpret Islam and try to convince people. My studies about communism. This is if people are confused. Why is this person thinking about communism? They try to really reinterpret Islam such that to say that there is not really a contradiction between Islam and communism, which is similar to the Waria when they were talking about, am I halal or not for being Waria and for sleeping with same sex? Am I Muslim or am I sinning? So this is actually productive, but this productivity is cancelled, meaning it's not allowed to be there. One strong contribution from this work is your contribution to knowledge production, which is so loyal to the Indonesian queer, Muslim queer and trans, loyal to their defining of their world, in that you don't really, impose theorizing from outside, but rather you bring these Indonesian experiences and their own terms, and turn them into concepts back to the world. And that's, I find it so beautiful. And so what we have is a very rich, spanning years of fieldwork, you say over a decade of fieldwork and observation. And I mean, I imagine that the experience also, shape who you are as an intellectual, and we'd like to hear that from you. Another strength, and I think this has to be highlighted, that if it's not clear yet, that Ferdi does not, both in the way he theorized and narrate the story, he doesn't put these people as a victim. This is not a story of victimization. This is actually a story of agency, like what he said. It's a story of resistance, not the kind of resistance that where you go outside and protest. But it's a story of resistance in which the Indonesian Muslim queers and trans, every single day, they resist by choosing to exist the way they choose, right? And continue to push that in that space, even though the society does not want to recognize them, want to in fact, push violence on them, right? So it's resistance by enduring otherwise, right? The many challenges, dangers, physical, emotional, that they face. So thank you so much for this contribution. And let's open the discussion for questions.
It's hard, I know, if you haven't read the book.
Oh, maybe in the
Also,
online.
if online wanted to.
I can start. I have questions. If there's nobody. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Oh, quick question. Maybe
If you could introduce yourself and then the question.
I am very lucky.
Lily.
What's your
My name
name?
is Lily. So maybe expand a little bit about how, if I'm not mistaken, how you were saying about enduring
Mm-hmm.
can be generative.
Mm-hmm.
How can one, in the context of being a social being,
Mm-hmm.
not an individual being, how can enduring
Mm.
be generative?
Mm. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I can go back to the stories of my friends here in the book about, for instance, Maya, for instance, who had a long traumatizing experience since she came out as a trans basically, and then she at some point she had to leave home and then become a sex worker, or initially, right away becoming a sex worker. Not only at first she went to Malaysia, and then she went to Medan, Banda Aceh, and each of these places she encountered violence in different forms, from the sex work clients, the pimp, the police, the neighbors. That when I met her, she stayed in Namu, right? And then she opens this hair salon. Oh yeah, and also at some point she works in hair salons as well. But when she works in hair salons in Aceh, she's not allowed to express her gender. So she has to hide her hair inside in the head and wearing caps basically. And so when she came back to her hometown, which is Namu, she created, or she opened a business, right? A hair salon. But for her, it's not just a hair salon. It's actually a space that where she can make sure that her friends won't experience the same thing as she does when she was younger, for instance. So she loves her friends, or sometimes some of them are still what they call machi. Makcik in Aceh, you have to like makcik Pak Pera and makcik Pak Jan. Makcik Pak Pera is like makcik who's like already comfortable in wearing women's clothing in everyday life, and also sometimes they have a bit of squabble with not with their neighbors or with their family members, but more or less they're comfortable in doing everyday life as they are, right? And there's Makcik Pak Jan who is still apprehensive about appearing as a woman, so they will leave home as a wearing men's clothing, but inside the hair salon they start to put on makeups, wear hair wigs, and this is what Maya also support them. Like, so for me, just a long story to give you an example on how by enduring her this, but also transforming it into a form of solidarity and care is something that I found important, or this is how one example of it.
John, did you have a question?
Oh, no.
Hi, I'm Nathan, still a student at Columbia. Thank you. I think it's very fascinating, and I'm wondering, like, how do you see your book in conversation with, if we want to deconstruct the sexual hegemony in Indonesia? Because, if I remember correctly, in the Christian space, we talk about like the Sodom and Gomorrah as one of the main point that makes Christianity or like evangelical Christianity
Mm.
hate the trans queer community, and yeah, I just wanna know like how do you see this book can.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because also as I prepare or write the book, I also talk with because when I did my fieldwork, there wasn't so much yet queer and trans who are at the front when it comes to talking about religiosity as Islam, for instance. But nowadays there are more, and they're even one of the discussant of the book launch next month in Berlin will be joining from Indonesia. Marafika is a well-known trans activist of faith, for instance. But and this discourse when I started my fieldwork, I couldn't find it anywhere. No one, even my research participants were like, "Wow, this is all new to us." Like to be confronted with question about how they feel about what they believe in is hard to. It's like yeah, it's mind-boggling, right? But as even that was like 10 years ago, I can see how the public sphere is changing, where the queer activists themselves are becoming less confrontational to religious leaders, knowing that actually this kind of like hard activism also didn't bring so much want to change. If anything, it create more backlash. But also there are like feminists, Islamic scholars that has been actively holding space for this kind of conversation, but also being very brave, saying to public, what's their name now? But unfortunately, because of that, she lost her position. She works in the ministry of religious ministry. If I remember her name, I will mention it later. But what I'm trying to say is through this network, a feminist network, there's a lot of conversation about the way to approach this is yes on text. It's kind of difficult to argue against text, but also this is interpretation, right? But the thing is, the dominant interpretation, the patriarchal domination interpretation, is the one that is accepted, well popularized, and also inherited through religious education. But the way to or their invitation to people is to try to approach it through humanity. To this is also the aim of the book, like to speak to the human, not so much about preaching or kind of glorifying or what have you, but actually hoping that maybe from the other side, if they happen to encounter the book and then they could empathize. So this also in religion, this idea of humanity is something that is important. Like a lot of people forget that a lot of repression are caused by difference, but people forgot that also it's part of religious subjectivity or religious task for us to care and to protect and to promote humanity. Right?
Hi. Hi, I'm Kai from NYU. So I think this is a bit on a darker note, but I was wondering if you could talk more about whether like conservative Islam as a phenomenon has changed a lot in the years that you've done fieldwork. I think you mentioned that it was legal changes, but you also mentioned like the figure of like the vigilante.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
I mean, with the vigilante, to be honest, since the time of Joko Widodo, because I don't know if you know what happened in Indonesia, as part of his breakthrough, or maybe actually going back to the past, is by banning Islamic vigilante groups. But at the same time, this is the cunningness about structural violence, is that they also adopt more benign language. So now more and more there's a group called AILA, for instance, Asosiasi Cinta Keluarga of Love Family Alliance, which is actually a local translation of the Family Watch International here in the US, which promote ideas about care, about protecting the children, or providing support for those who doesn't want to be gay or lesbian anymore by conversion. So they're using this kind of language of solidarity and care as well. So it's kind of becoming, I mean, it's obvious they meant violent, but it's getting hard to, you know, put it in like black and white, which one is which.
My name is Harry, PhD student at Yale. I'm curious I would ask a question about the relationship between endurance and faith, because it strikes me that as I reflect on this idea, like one of the ways in which we endure is through appealing to spirit, faith, like kind of belief beyond reason, or So in some senses, I'm finding a kind of spiritual connotation to it,
Yes.
maybe that I don't see in resilience, and
Yeah.
these other terms you mentioned. In the story you mentioned, I'm sure there are many different stories in the book, but in the story you mentioned, there's an instance of violence from the local religious law, from Sharia law, maybe from adat too. So I'm noticing maybe this interesting dynamic here where Muslim, queer, and trans people are enduring attacks from motivated by interpretations of Islam, but are also maybe calling upon their own faith in order to do so. So it's like you're enduring the attacks of faith while drawing from faith. So I guess my question is a little bit, can you say more about that dynamic, or maybe what have you learned about
Your spaces of ambivalence.
Yeah, good question. I mean, yes.
I was gonna ask any questions from the participants online. Not yet. Oh, not yet.
Yeah, with storytelling, of course, yeah, it helps them to endure any forms of hardships, but also there's a limit to it, right? In a way that, and this is also something that is expressed by Anna, for instance, who announced that she's an ex-Muslim. She's queer and she's an ex-Muslim because she thinks that she couldn't handle anymore. Like the contradiction was too much. That was a moment where she was basically she's already proclaiming as a non-believer, so she stopped practicing prayers. But at some point, she had a relationship with her girlfriend, and she doesn't know who to connect with. And then she prayed to God, that they want us. She wants us the relationship to go back to go back to her partner, basically. And it was dikabulin.
Kabulin is
It's granted.
Is granted.
It's granted. They become couples again. And for her, this feeling of like a God an institutional God whose name has been used against her, but also at the same time becomes the only place for her solace. Kind of like, and she translates it as this wrenching feeling in her gut. That's how she described it, right? So, but even after she that's why she make these boundaries. Okay, I'm an ex-Muslim. I will not. So what she does is that she believes in God as an energy, and she's into more spirituality. She believes that she can pray to any God, any worship place. It's not just mosque anymore. She goes to churches. She goes to temples, right? But at the same time, if you read the book further, she'll start telling me other stories that's nothing to do with my research question, to show that when you think that we have gone through or move on from certain contradiction or certain topics, it tends to sometimes you find it in a different way. So discussion is not so much for her. It's not so much more about she has a problem with being alone. For instance, she's always in constant search for with being with anyone at all, including talking with someone on the phone at night because of other issues that she experienced. She called it a monophobia, a fear of being alone. Uh, uh, so this is also another part of the story that, yeah, this idea of conflict or inner conflict, it follows us. I'm 48 years old. I'm aging myself now. 48 years old. I'm still dealing with a lot of inner conflict, right? We thought that it ends by the time we reach 20, and then it continues 30, and it continues 50, 40. Yes. Right.
I was wondering if you could speak about would you situate this queer, Muslim queer and trans experiences within the broader structure of the movement, because there is a movement, like the Gaya Nusantara, for example. Dede Utomo was here last year, right? So I was wondering how, how did they connect?
So
they are-
Dede is endorsing my book.
Yeah.
And his endorsement was activists should read this book. Yes, there are kind of like connections between the so-called like the activists and the people that I met, but it's not always in unison. And also I share that in the book, but also there's this bias, right? Even my own friends of privilege, gay, cis male, middle class, when I told them about my research, I'm going to Aceh to do this research, and their question was, why are you bothering with them? They're hypocrites. Like if they don't want to be there, they have to leave. They can leave anytime they want. So if they stay there, so doesn't they don't deserve your attention. It was like, so yeah, like this kind of like
This class dimension
class
also.
dimension, but also activists sometimes feel like that these people are helpless because they're such a believers that actually it's not true. Like there are different layers of scales of believing, and sometimes you just need to make extra effort. And there are activists who are recently working with that, like the Pesantren, the Islamic boarding, that's one Islamic boarding school.
There's the savior mentality among activists. That sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, it's part of their nature. I mean, it's part of our nature of activists wanting to stay.
Yeah.
But yeah.
We have.
My name is Shreya. I'm from University of North Carolina, and I'm just in town for a couple days, and this talk looked really interesting. But I was curious, like, with you saying that about activists and like the perception of these folks with activists and that kind of culture, like in my own research experience, or just like even like what I've read is like there's so much apprehension sometimes to work with academics. And so I'm curious like what that relationship was for you personally. And like how maybe also how that varied with like working with an academic versus working with an activist.
Yeah. Question. I mean, the people who actually rejected me the most, like blatantly, are activists. I literally come to their office. I know they're inside, but they didn't open the door.
Oh wow!
After before we had lunch and we talk about like, hey, let's have a meeting tomorrow, but like I'm introducing myself as I'm the previous stage, but it didn't work out. So there goes my blood. But as an academic, yes, I do, especially if you go to these more rural areas. One of the first reaction, and they didn't make it into the book because I got no consent at the end. But they were like, what are you doing here? Like, are you going to be one of those people who report on the news that there's this much of gay people, lesbian in the city, and make us looks bad, and make Islam looks bad, make Aceh looks bad? And I was a bit defensive at that time. I was like, yeah, I'm trying to keep on explaining, but the more I explain, the more they kind of like push me. But then I stopped at one point in one moment, and then think actually they have something to say about what academic does or research does, right?
Can be very
So I turn it into question, like what do they think about us doing? And again, like it's not for everyone, and I'm so lucky that I was able to meet these people. I have to say, some of them I know for a long time, even before I start my master study. But others are like fresh. I met through the encounters.
Yes,
question.
please, yes.
My name's Michelle, friend, fan of Ferdy. You mentioned, and many congratulations,
Thank you.
and the premiere reading. You'll be doing this in Berlin. Where else are you doing it?
In Casco.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
And Indonesia, hopefully.
Okay.
But already people told me, oh yeah, you're not going to be so be ready that people will not welcome you back home. I'm also, to be completely honest, like I finished my fieldwork 2015, like 10 years ago, right? 15, and then the anti-LGBT thing happened in 2016, that I kind of like strategically decide, oh, maybe I have to wait until really submit, just to see what's going on. And this continued until 2018, the whole kind of culmination of the moral panic. But it kind of resides, and then COVID happened, but still I'm not sure when actually to publish it. I just, when it's like, because I don't want to bring attention to the community that I work with, but at the same time, yeah, I have to share it to the world. So, what was your question? Yeah, Indonesia.
That was the
Yeah.
question. And where else would you like it?
This person asked if you're willing to speak in Singapore, perhaps at the Progressive Muslim or Queer Muslim Spaces.
Of course.
Now you have another invitation. You wanna address that question? Oh, is Michelle's question that has been addressed?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
About where to do the launch. Or I'm also thinking of translating it to Indonesian.
Yeah, you should. It should be interesting. Nathan, you raise your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the visibility. Do you think that the visibility of trans queer communities using your book or like other activism or whatever it is in Indonesia is still, no, not still, like how do you see it? Because like last month Tempo have like a video about like the queer people talking about human rights, and they got bashed, and all of the communities are getting harmful messages from like Indonesian folks. And yeah, how do you see this question?
In terms of my protagonist, the protagonist,
I'm really making sure that they're not recognizable in any, because not only I use pseudonyms for their names, their location, I use composites. So this is a mix of, so one person is not one person, but a mix of.
Interesting.
A mix of.
We should have talked about the method, like really protect the protagonist. But there is a
Question online.
I'll read it since it's kind of long. Hi, Ferdi, great work, and it was a delight listening to you. It strikes me how similar this sensibility of endurance and ambivalence is between queer religious persons in Indonesia and the Philippines. You mentioned about how agency is not just about resistance, but also imagining otherwise. I'm curious how your interlocutors imagine this better or future world? Question mark.
I think in my presentation also I emphasized that this question around the leap, right? When people talk about transformation, people imagine that there's a leap, like this kind of like uh kind of a break between current reality and the new reality, but it doesn't work like that. It goes through ages and generation to come to where we are now, as it is like I had a conversation with a reverend lady reverend from Indonesia, and she's totally agreeing with me, but at the same time also, when do you think things will change in Indonesia? I would say like maybe another 40 years. Because like
If it still exists, climate change is
Yes.
catching up with us.
exactly, so it's either that or either we all think in or but yeah, what I'm trying to say is, but even in that condition, people continue to live, right, in their own way as best as they can. And I have always this, oh, actually not always, but recently I had a conversation with a podcast conversation about the book, and the interviewer is Andy Fuller. He's an ex-academic who becomes a running coach, and I use my marathon as a metaphor. When we do marathon, when we are inside ourselves, just running and think, respirating, running out of breath, couldn't continue anymore. And then you start seeing people around you, people cheering, watching on the street, people who's running with you is also running, and you start to feel, okay, then I go on, in a sense that this is why it's super important. The relational aspects of endurance is important. It's not just about psychological inner capacity, but also it's about how people around us also strengthen us in a way, and then when they strengthen us, we want to also strengthen them, right? So this kind of like going back and forth, and this is also something that we need to think about, and under current circumstances where it feels like it's endless, there's so much pressure, there's nothing that much that we can do, but actually there's so much that we can do, and this is proven by the community who has much more difficult situations in dealing with, that they can continue, that we can continue, but together, there's no way we can survive on our own.
No, we have to fight together. Well, that actually is such a beautiful way to end this book launch. Thank you so much for Ferdi for this amazing. Yeah, and I just want to say this book is just out of the press, New York University Press. And during otherwise, please, I think Ferdi has a discount code. So you should go to
NYUpress.org, look for Enduring Otherwise. If you're ordering from Canada or US, there's a code NYUAU 30.
30.
It's like 30%.
Excellent. So 30% discount, folks. So there is no reason to not buy it. Also, for those who are here, if you don't mind, because this is such an important day for Ferdi, we'd like to take a photo together as a part of the celebration. Thank you again for everyone for coming, those online and also in person. Okay, photo in the front. Okay. Let's take photo here.